We've got 100 pages left in this book, but my guess is it's going to go rather swiftly towards the end here, because Spong has been building up to the points that he wants to make, and we're at a transition point now. Last week we looked at chapter 19, and we're moving from the discourses that Jesus is having, his so-called farewell discourses, to the passion narrative. And Jesus basically, in this section of John chapter 15, is trying to teach his disciple this new way of being in the world. Spong has pointed out time and time again that the Gospel of John, influenced by the mystical tradition that what we might call the Platonic mystical tradition, that has its own instantiation, you might say, in Jewish mysticism, Merkabah mysticism. And Spong is making the point that John is seeing Jesus as precisely through the lens of Merkabah mysticism. The other point that he wants to make is that, we're reading this gospel on two levels. It is customary for us to often read the gospel and think that we're, thinking about Jesus in real time, that we're recording stories of the historical Jesus. But more important here, I think Spong would argue, yes, we're talking about Jesus in his time in 30 of the Common Era, but more importantly, we're talking about an interpretation of Jesus that is written 60 years after in 90 of the Common Era, written by the Johannine community. And we're going to probably conclude with that today and why that's important for us. But the last time we met, we were talking about this idea of God as this pervasive presence, what Paul Tillich called the ground of being, of which Jesus is a part. He is fully united with this ground of being, one with God. I and the Father am one. And throughout this gospel, there have been a number of the so-called I am sayings. And you might remember that I am is the literal interpretation of Yahweh, which is the name of God in the Hebrew Bible. So if you're Jewish and you're listening to Jesus saying, I am the vine and you are the branches, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and I am the door, a number of I am sayings, it does not have to become explicit that Jesus is making this claim that he and the Father are one. Now, interestingly, in this final farewell discourse, he's trying to teach his disciples, and they're not getting it, of course. We've got several disciples who just don't quite understand what he's trying to say, but he's trying to teach them that, look, just as he is in the Father and united in unity with the Father, so can they be united to the Father through him. This is open to everyone. It's not an easy way to be in the world because most people don't see God as this ground of being, this pervading presence, but as an external being. But the whole movement in the Gospel of John is to emphasize this internal God. At the end of chapter 15, where we ended last week, Jesus says, basically, I know you disciples don't get this now. I've tried as best I could in the way I live, in the way that I teach, to emphasize this indwelling God who is the ground of all things. But there will come a time where you'll understand, you will look back, and it will become exceedingly clear to you. And that will happen as a result of my continuing presence through, well, John refers to it as the advocate, has Jesus referred to it as the advocate or the paraclete, the comforter, the presence of Jesus that is going to abide with the disciples long after the physical body of Jesus is gone. And it's going to be through this advocate that they will look back on the teaching and they'll say, aha, I get it now. I understand what he was saying. But at this point in the narrative, they don't get it. So that's where we were last time. The idea that Jesus is the vine, the disciples are the branches. Apart from the vine, they cannot live. It's just a wonderful gardening image, but if they are connected to the vine, they can produce fruit, and that's what they're now being called to do. So I think of yourselves as the branches of the vine and see how we are all bound together in this divine purpose. That's what Spong is saying, as Jesus is saying to the disciples. I, Jesus, flow into you. If you abide in me, I will abide in you. So you see this nice parallelism. Jesus abides in God, the Father. The disciples abide in Jesus. And we might extend beyond that. The church now, the church that is an extension of the disciples, abides in Jesus. But we really have to emphasize here that this is, I was talking to Pastor Greg about this, and he was saying, do people in this class really realize how radical this is? And in juxtaposition to our Sunday Forum class right now, where we're looking at the confessions of the church, the creeds of the church are all going to be founded on and established on this understanding of the external God, this understanding of Jesus as a sacrifice offered up for God, in whose blood we are cleansed and we are justified before God. This is not, I will emphasize here, this is not Orthodox theology. Far from it. This is a theology that many people will raise their eyebrows at. So I just wanted to emphasize that, because you're probably not going to hear much preaching like this in the church. So, any comments before we move on?
Yeah, Dan, just a quick one. See if you agree with this. I mean, it's one thing to say that that Spong's, a bit radical, and I think that that's not radical, but he's liberal. But I mean, you can almost say that the Gospel of John itself is that. It's not really Spong's fault. I mean, I have a problem reading through this and wondering how much of this is, John and how much of this is Spong.
Right.
And I think it's most, but the more I read it, the more I think this is the Gospel of John. When Spong says he does not talk about redemption from sin, he doesn't talk about that.
Yeah.
I mean, so I don't know how radical of a theology it is when it really pretty much, a literal reading of the Gospel of John, you don't find a lot of that stuff.
Yeah. Well, let's see, what's happened is that the synoptic gospels have informed the reading of the Gospel of John, right? And the synoptic gospels, with this understanding of this atonement, and this is why the Jesus Seminar is so important, because it really emphasized the need to try to read texts on their own merits, right? Don't bring your theology to the text. And the church can't help but do this, because the very first emphasis in the church early on was the tradition of the church as defined by the confessions, right? We believe in God the Father Almighty, and that confession becomes then the lens through which we read the Bible, right? But what the Jesus Seminar did is say, look, you scholars, leave your confessions at the door. We're going to pop in here, and we're going to look at these texts, and one text isn't going to interpret the other, which is another thing that theologians say, that Scripture interprets Scripture. If something seems to be missing in John, well, you can look for it in Luke, and it will explain itself. But John is an anomaly among the synoptics. And when we think about it, at least in terms of the confessions that would come later, the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, and the ones that we're looking at in our forum, it's hard to imagine how it is that John made it in at all. but he did. And so this is where we are, and you know, you probably won't ever hear a reading of John. You won't hear preaching about John that is informed just by John in its historical context. It's always going to be informed by theology that's been well established over the centuries. And this is why it's radical to read what Spong is reading, because you know, he's doing what we should do with all people, really. When we come to them, we should allow them to reveal themselves instead of us bringing our pre-understandings or our presuppositions or our biases to our perception of them, right? We're not doing that with the Gospel of John. And all of this, as far as I can see, really, really holds together. You will see how little we are referring to the Synoptic Gospels in this. It's all internal to John. So any other thoughts on that? I don't want to belabor that point. But this is not your, what do they say? This is not your father's gospel. This is not your grandparents' gospel.
Yeah, I think maybe part of the issue is, I remember when I was younger, you know, I had a Bible that had, you know, it's called the red letter version. I'm sure there's out there where everything that Jesus said was in red. So you got the true word. Well, you know, there was more red in the Gospel of John than anywhere else.
Right.
But the Jesus Seminar, when they do their version of that, they have no red.
Yeah, that's right.
None, zero.
No red letter at all. This is all the words of John being placed into the mouth of Jesus from the perspective of the Johannine community and then the 9th or the 10th century of the Common Era. And understanding it like that really opens a lot of helpful doors, I think. Yes. In fact, do you remember, Mac? I think one of the only things that they could say really came, whether this in the Synoptic or John at all, there were very few words of Jesus that they really established as authentic. And I think one of those was the name Abba as father, Abba Father. What were some of the others? Do you remember, Mac?
The only thing I remember was they had one passage that got the pink designation, which I think is, you know, he probably didn't say it, but he could have, you know, or it's the way he thought. But that was it. There was just one. And the rest of it was solid black, which for them means definitely did not say. So, you know, what we're reading is not Jesus. We're reading John. Yeah.
The Johannine community. Well, there is one. Go ahead, Will.
Well, Dan, I was just thinking of Thomas Jefferson. I think Jefferson would have liked reading Spong, because Jefferson reduced the New Testament to whatever it was, 40 pages or something.
Yeah, the Jefferson Bible.
Think he might have liked reading Spong?
Yeah. Well, he at least that idea that you could take an X-Acto knife and cut out the things that he wouldn't use the same criteria that Spong is using. But Jefferson did just that as well. He was using his own Enlightenment ideas.
Exactly.
This is
the Enlightenment.
This is something that's theologically informed. Therefore, I don't take it. But this statement of Jesus that we should love each other as we love ourselves, well, that's a good Enlightenment principle. You know, that's a good fraternity, equality, and liberty principle, right? And so the Enlightenment Jesus, the Jesus that appeals to the intellectuals of the 18th century, comes through in the Jefferson Bible that way. But this is the mystical Jesus that we're looking at here. Denny, am I forgetting? You're not on my on the list there. I'm just making sure that you're getting.
Which list did I slip off from?
Well, there's these 5. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pictures, and then if I'm up at the top, then you are not not shown. So I want to make sure that I'm catching your face in case you want to say something.
Oh well.
Well, that's what happens when you're first in Zoom. The first shall be last. at least in terms of the grid that we see. Well, we've reached now a place in the Gospel of John, chapter 17, and there was a biblical scholar by the name of Ernst Kasiman, and this is somebody I read in seminary, who said this is the pivotal chapter in the Gospel of John. This is the place where there's a dividing line. Prior to this, we saw the discourses, the farewell discourses, the I am sayings, the texts where Jesus is teaching his disciples. After this, we're going to see the passion narrative. But this is the place where Jesus is basically, I guess this is a soliloquy in many ways. This would be Hamlet's to be or not to be. Jesus speaking his mind without any reference to anybody else. And this is the story of the Garden of Gethsemane. And if you compare this story, and this is relevant to what we were just talking about, if you can compare this story to the other Gospels, the so-called synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you will see just how much they have been influenced by the atonement theology that we still hold, or at least that many churches still hold central to their theology, that Jesus sees himself about to be sacrificed on the cross to offer this up to the Father for the forgiveness of sins, that he is a sacrificial lamb. That story we find in Mark. There's an interesting little addition that we find in Luke that I wanted to show here. This is the story of Gethsemane as depicted in Luke, where Jesus is actually comforted by an angel, kind of like a guardian angel there, because of the overwhelming distress, the sadness, the anxiety, the existential reality that we all face. This is the end of the line. There's going to be a point when all of us are going to have to, really come to grips with the fact that my destiny is in front of me here. I'm about to die. If we see this and then of course Luke offers this angel that comes down and of course comforts Jesus in this and offers words of solace. But this is not what we see in the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John, Jesus is almost, it's probably too much to say excited about this, but the story is introduced by the hour has come. Prior to this time, we've seen Jesus saying, my hour has not come. My time has not come. Woman, what would you do with me? My time has not come. But now this transition, the hour has come. And the understanding what this hour means is going to be laid out in chapter 17. And this is what Spong is referring to as the so-called high priestly prayer. And I thought I would, and I realize I probably don't do this enough in here because I assume, and probably not correctly, that you all know the story so well, and I don't need to be reading it, but since this is such a pivotal story, I thought I'd read it, and so we can see what Spong is referring to. So after Jesus had spoken these words, he's talking to his disciples. Now you're speaking plainly, not in any figure of speech. Do you now believe? This is that discourse that we just got through, and the vine, on the vine, you are the branches. After Jesus had spoken these words, he looked up to heaven and said, Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son so that the Son may glorify you, since you have given him authority over all people to give eternal life to all whom you have given him. And this is his eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent. I glorified you on earth by finishing the work that you gave me to do. So now, Father, glorify me in your own presence with the glory that I had in your presence before the world existed. Now we're getting a callback to the prologue. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, right? I am fulfilling the role that you gave me even before creation started. And I want to talk about this down the bottom on this outline where I talk about the theodicy of Irenaeus, okay? I have made your name known to those whom you gave me from the world. They were yours, and you gave them to me, and they have kept your word. Now they know that everything you have given me is from you. For the words that you gave me, I have given to them. They have received them and know in truth that I have come from you, and they have believed that you sent me. I am asking on their behalf. I'm not asking on behalf of the world, but on behalf of those whom you gave me, because they are yours. All mine are yours, and yours are mine, and I have been glorified in them. And now I am no longer in the world, but they are in the world, and I'm coming to you. Holy Father, protect them in your name that you have given me, so that they may be one as we are one. So that they may be one as we are one. Go back to this idea of the vine and the branches. Now the doorway is going to be open, so the oneness of the disciples with Christ and thus with God can be finally accomplished with the cross. It seems almost counterintuitive that the cross is going to be glory or glorification. While I was with them, I protected them in your name that you have given me. I guarded them, and not one of them was lost except the one destined to be lost. Of course, referring here to Judas, so that the scripture might be fulfilled. But now I am coming to you, and I speak these things in the world so that they may have my joy made complete in themselves. I have given them your word, and the world has hated them because they do not belong to the world, just as I do not belong to the world. I'm not asking you to take them out of the world, but I ask to protect them from the evil one. They do not belong to the world, just as I do not belong to the world. Sanctify them in truth. Your word is truth. As you have sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. And for their sakes, I sanctify myself, so that they may be sanctified on earth. So a lot of convoluted language there. But this is interesting because, if you read mystical literature, it's so difficult to talk about God and our oneness with God without using paradoxical types of language. And Jesus does a lot of connections. I am in you, God, and they are in me, and thus we are unified. This is what the whole priestly prayer is about. Unity of the world with God through Christ. Now there are just 12 who, after Jesus' glorification, will become unified through Christ with God. They will become unified with Christ and with God at the same. But it's also their mission to go out, as branches will spread their tendrils, right? To go out into the world and to produce fruit, to bring others into that mystical union with God, what we call the body of Christ. And this is the focus of the prayer. There's none of this, woe is me. I hate even to say it, almost sounds sacrilegious, but there's none of this fear, none of this, my blood will soon, be spilled out. Take this cup from me. I don't know that if I can handle it. Jesus knows this is the reason he's come. And he is going into this very willingly. So this high priestly prayer that I just read, the focus is on primarily the fact that these disciples, that Jesus is unified with God, the disciples can be unified with God, and those whom the disciples will preach to eventually can be unified with God. This is the beginning of the whole messianic idea that you will become a blessing to all the nations. We've seen how Jesus, the suffering servant, has taken over the role of Israel, the suffering servant, that we saw in Isaiah 53. And it's through this suffering that a blessing will be given to the world. But there's also this really interesting thing that that Spong talks about. At the end of this prayer, he starts to think about the future of the disciples and what they're going to endure. And Spong says that these words in the mouth of Jesus are spoken directly to the Johannine community, through the author John, who were experiencing persecution at this time. The year is about 90 of the Common Era, and Jesus in his prayer is giving them, the readers of Jesus' words in 90 of the Common Era, giving them comfort. John is having Jesus look towards their persecution and try to offer some solace in what they are doing. As Christ has suffered, so must you suffer. But the outcome is what God has in mind. So I just wanted to read this section that Spong points out on page 205. The death of Jesus will not be the end of his life. I'm right in the middle of the page. It will be the moment when the meaning of God is ultimately revealed, the moment in which Jesus will be glorified, because the world will see God in him when he's on the cross. The world will see God in Jesus when Jesus is on the cross. There, Jesus will reveal God as the portrait of an expanded life, limitless love, and enhanced being. It is an invitation to walk through the door of Christ. I am the door. To follow the way of Christ. I am the way. And to enter into the expanded life of Christ. I am the resurrection. This idea of resurrection as expansion is something that Spong is eventually going to expand upon. And then I wanted to skip ahead a few lines here on page 206, about 7 lines down. 3 lines down, actually. This is Spong concluding part 3, and it really comes back to what we were talking about. Nowhere does John give credibility to the dreadful, guilt-producing and guilt-filled mantra that Jesus died for my sins. We are not fallen, we are simply incomplete. We do not need to be rescued, but to experience the power of an all-embracing love. Our call is not to be forgiven or even to be redeemed, but our call is to step beyond our limits into a new understanding of what it means to be human. Believe it or not, this was actually an idea that was introduced as early as the 2nd century and is really a part of a lot of Greek Orthodox thinking yet today. I should say Orthodox with a capital O thinking today, Eastern Orthodox. But before I talk about that, I've been doing a lot of talking. I don't want to be, are there any comments about this? Things that you might want to, Denny.
Dan, one of the things that I do not see discussed very often is the amount of courage that Jesus possessed.
Yeah.
Knowing what was going to happen to him, because he was confronting the power structure of the Roman procurators and also the high priests of the temple. That
Right.
Probably this was an inevitable. And I think John Dominic Crossan and Marcus Borg in their book, The Final Week, make this very clear in terms of how he entered Jerusalem and how the Romans entered from the other side at the same time.
Yep.
And the collision was clearly there.
Yeah. And he knew it was coming. And actually, this is something that a friend of mine who's kind of an iconoclast, is an iconoclast. It's really tempting if you read the theology into this, to say what my friend says, and that is, hey, Jesus didn't have to be scared because he knew, he was God. He knew how it was going to end up. And almost as if, he could remove himself from the suffering, that he really truly didn't suffer. Oh no, I mean, that is heretical, right? It's the idea that God does suffer that we're talking about. And that comes back to your point, Denny, is this idea of courage. That those who are deemed weak in the world are actually the ones who are the strongest. But demonstrating that love overcomes violence, love overcomes the militaristic, machinations of our world. To live that out requires courage. And this is why Paul Tillich wrote his book, The Courage to Be, because it's precisely what Jesus is saying in his, high priestly prayer. This is not going to be a cakewalk, right? This expanded life, you're not going to win the lottery unless the lottery is something that's going to bring a lot of pain and suffering onto you. You are going to be outcasts in the world. But your life will take on this expanded understanding of who God is and God's presence in the world. So it's quite a trade-off. It's really a lot easier not to believe, to just stay with the external God who it requires you to follow all the little rules and hope that one day you go to heaven. You don't have to deal with the paradox of being one with God yet suffering in the world that way, right? But this is what Jesus is going to demonstrate. If you are one with God, if you are part of the vine, if you are producing fruit, there will be those who are going to try to prune you back. But how you live in this world may pass away, but the source of your living, the presence of God, that love will not pass away, as Paul says, right? And ultimately, that will overcome the aspects of this world that is represented by Rome, or even some of the Jewish religious authorities. So, any other comments about this? Yeah, good stuff. Well, I wanted to talk about this. I mentioned this a little while ago, and I know we've been at this for quite some time, but there was a theologian in the 2nd century by the name of Irenaeus. Irenaeus of Lyon in Gaul of the time. He was a theologian who really was writing at a time of some pretty severe persecution, as well as the one who suggested that there be 4 gospels. And the ones that he identified were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, primarily because they seemed to be the ones that were being read the most in the churches around the Roman Empire, around the Mediterranean at the time. But Irenaeus also wrote about what it is that happens in redemption. And what he said sounds very, very similar to what we're talking about now. And it comes back to this idea that we see in Genesis chapter 1, that God created human beings in God's image. In the image and likeness, he created them. And so Irenaeus saw salvation history as this movement from the image of God. We have the image of God. We have the ability to communicate with God, to know God, through our observations of the world, to pray to God, to act as God would have us act. That is what it means to be the image of God. But it's only going to be with the coming of Christ that we're talking about here that we can attain the likeness with God. We can become like God through Christ, becoming part of that vine once again. Irenaeus did not have this theodicy of atonement that said we fell into sin and now we need to be saved through a sacrifice. There is sin in traditional theology is human depravity, the inability of the bondage of our will to do anything right, and our tendency always to do what is bad or evil. But there's also the sin that comes from ignorance, or a willful desire on our part to simply feed our own ego. We have the ability to commune with God, but many times our ego gets in the way of that, and we look out after our own interests instead of the interests of others in love. And Irenaeus says, when we're created in the image of God, we do have the opportunity to make those choices, but it's only going to become through Christ. It's only going to be through Christ that we can become the likeness of God. And thus the world can also attain that unity with God as well. There's no sense of a fall into irredeemable sin apart from the sacrifice of Christ. And this is what we're talking about here in Spong's book. This is what is really the Eastern Orthodox approach to redemption. There is an Eastern Orthodoxy, something called theosis, through your own spiritual discipline arising to, well, frankly, theosis means divinity, the divine character of a human being, becoming one with God. So there is a strand in theology that upholds this. It's just not our Western strand that we've been talking about, the one that we find in the Confessions. Any thoughts about that? Comments? Well, then I will move on to our next slide here. We're now entering part 4. And this is the Passion narrative. We've passed that watershed of the high priestly prayer where Jesus, explains, or Jesus has a soliloquy, a prayer to God that really lays out what his mission is all about, what the mission of the church will be all about for those who gain unity with him. But Spong's approach now is going to be highly, highly symbolic. And all of the stories that we know so well that we will be reading very soon, as Holy Week approaches, Spong is going to say, don't fall into the habit, as you have in the past, of reading these as literal stories, because they are object lessons, and they are object lessons written for a specific group of people in 90 of the Common Era. And so he begins chapter 21, entitled A Brief Introduction to the Climax of the Gospels. He reminds us, hey, there's 2 levels. That's what I was saying at the beginning of our time together. There are 2 levels on which we can read the Gospel of John. One is stories about the historical Jesus happening in the time of Jesus. But more likely, what we're reading when we look at the Gospel of John are stories that are written in 90 of the Common Era that have, well, 2 objectives. One is to explain their understanding, John's understanding of Jesus' mission in the world to make us one with the ground of being, God, but also to give comfort to the Johannine community who is undergoing and experiencing a lot of turmoil, a lot of just they've had the rug pulled out from under them. So and Spong reminds us of this, let's remind ourselves what it is that they are going through. There are 3 levels of history in the Gospel of John, and the level that we're working with right now is the 3rd one, and we see this throughout. But the Book of Signs was probably something that came from the first when the disciples were part of the synagogue. But anyway, the 3 experiences of the Johannine community in the first 40 years of their life, they saw themselves, after the death and resurrection of Jesus, as part of the synagogue. They identified themselves as Jews, but they wanted to impress upon their Jewish, peers in the synagogue the importance of the messianic character of Jesus. They came to be known as the Way. They're the ones who follow the way of Jesus of Nazareth, or Jesus they claim to be the Christ. And for a while, it appeared that they were relatively accepted. They didn't have great turmoil. But it's hard to imagine that, claiming that the Messiah has come would not create a problem in the synagogue. But remember, at this time, there were a lot of messianic movements. One of those was the Jesus movement. And they understood Jesus within the context of the Hebrew Bible. So it was possible for Jews to interpret him in this very Jewish way. But tragedy happens, really. And it's a tragedy of their own making. In 66 of the Common Era, the Jews of Judea revolt against the Romans. They, for a number of reasons, what they believe to be oppressive political structures, but also the idea that, these guys are interlopers. They're strangers in our land. We want to get them out of here. Bad idea. You're not going to destroy the Romans. And this, the siege of Judea, the siege of Jerusalem, and the warfare with Jewish rebels goes on for about 4 years, until 70 of the Common Era, the Romans under Vespasian and his son Titus in Jerusalem, go into Jerusalem, destroy the temple, kill everybody in their wake. Now the Jews have a really bad name, right? Anyone who's a Jew, because they were the people who inhabited Jerusalem, were on the bad list in among the Romans, right? So the Johannine community and synagogues of the time had to flee Jerusalem. And it appears that the Johannine community fled Jerusalem and found themselves in Ephesus. Now, why Ephesus, we don't know, but it's commonly been understood that the Gospel of John was written from the city of Ephesus. And there, the Jews in the synagogue are not going to be as open to the message of Jesus as the Christ as they were before. They're already in the crosshairs of the Romans. Now, you might remember when we looked at the book of Revelation, the Jews had a special dispensation from the Romans that they could worship as they wanted to worship. They could worship their God. They didn't have to, bow down to Caesar, as was required for all Romans. Well, now this all comes into question. And in the midst of the synagogue, between 70 and 88, you have this Johannine community creating problems at a time where the last thing the Jewish synagogue needs is problems, right? So they're expelled from the synagogue. Get out of here. You're just going to bring nothing but trouble to us, talking about Jesus as the Christ. So that's the second tier of the experience of the Johannine community. Notice how completely vulnerable now they are, because the Romans aren't going to recognize them as Jews. The Romans aren't going to recognize them as having this, this dispensation that allows them to worship as they want. They're going to be seen as regular old Roman citizens who are now worshiping another god and not worshiping Caesar. This is a really, really difficult spot to be in. And this is about the time that John would be writing his the revelation of John. It's traditionally been understood that the author of the Gospel of John also wrote the book of Revelation. But that's not entirely clear that that's the case, but there's at least a tradition there that's similar. So after about 90 of the Common Era, the followers of Jesus are no longer seen as Jews. They're no longer part of the synagogue. And now they have to define just who they are. What is it that we claim about Christ? And what they come up with and what they have been, developing all along, I should say. It's not like they fabricated it at 90 of the Common Era, but they certainly were put in a context where they had to think very, very theologically. And what they established in what we read in the Gospel of John is this affirmation of Jesus' oneness with God, as we just saw in that high priestly prayer. And it's going to be this message that is going to uplift the Johannine community and keep them dedicated and keep them devoted to this idea that we see, especially in the letters of John, the importance of love. It is through love that we demonstrate, that we manifest, that we incarnate Jesus, with whom we are one. This mystical understanding of the presence of God in their life that manifests itself as love. That's a little review. We've been talking about this, but I wanted to make sure that we were aware of those three aspects, those three experiences that have been developing for roughly 60 years as the community that was part of the synagogue now gets expelled from the synagogue. It's also in 90 of the Common Era that they see the synagogue, the Jews in the synagogue, as their enemies. And this is where we get the reference in John to the Jews, who are Jesus' enemies. That has been the foundation of a lot of anti-Semitism throughout our history, unfortunately. But they're, very specifically referring to the Jews who have rejected them and thus have rejected Jesus. So any comments are going on there? Denny?
Dan?
Yeah.
It seems to me that this period after 70 CE, clear through the book of John, had to be an extremely frightening period for these entire communities of
Right.
hearing into this. Where is this going?
Right.
There is no precedent, really, it seems to me, for what we're about. We know
Right.
how it ends many times.
Well, and now you understand why the book of Revelation, remember, you've got this apocalyptic strand that's been part of Judaism for quite some time as well, at least since, the time of Enoch, and probably filtered through the Essene community. But why the book of Revelation is going to provide solace and some sort of connection with the cosmic Christ, this was the context in which that was written as well. Very, very tumultuous, very precarious in the midst of the Roman world. Any other thoughts about this? Something that we probably can't even relate to. Well, the direction that we're going to go next is we're going to be looking at 4 character studies, basically. And our natural inclination when we read the Passion narrative and when we read these stories about these 4 characters is to think of them as historical figures. But Spong is going to say, don't do that. Imagine yourself, just as Denny was doing in 90 of the Common Era, wanting to gain some sort of insight into what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And the 4 people we're going to look at are going to be representative of experiences that the Johannine community is having. We'll look at Judas. We'll look at Peter, Simon Peter. We'll look at Pilate. And we'll look at a character who will be introduced called the beloved disciple. We don't know who this disciple was, but he plays a very, very prominent role, especially at the end of the gospel. It's the beloved disciple. I'll just kind of, reveal, what's coming. It's a beloved disciple who's going to be at the foot of the cross of Christ, of the cross of Christ. He's the one, if you remember the Eisenheim altarpiece, who is comforting Mary, holding her as she suffers, in grief, with Mary Magdalene kneeling at the foot of the cross, and then the gospel writer, the Gospel of John, pointing with this long kind of bent finger towards Jesus on the cross. Wonderful piece. I've used it many times, but I'll remind you again when we get to that point. It was Karl Barth's favorite art historical artifact. He had it hanging, an image of that hanging in his office, the so-called Eisenheim altarpiece, the central panel of that. But these characters are going to be representatives of the people in the context of 90 of the Common Era. Judas doesn't take much of a symbolic mind to know who Judas is, right? Judas is going to be a representative of the synagogue, those who have expelled the Jews, those who have turned their back on the way, the truth, and the life. Simon Peter, I should mention that in 90 of the Common Era, there was a lot of wavering back and forth. The people that were kicked out of the synagogue and followed the Johannine community, they couldn't quite, they couldn't quite live up to the standards that they felt, that the community expected of them. So they returned. They went back to the synagogue. And Peter is going to, in some ways, represent that kind of wavering group, those who, in their weakness. Pilate obviously is going to represent Rome. It's in the Gospel of John where Pilate and Jesus have this incredible philosophical conversation. What is truth? By the way, I've been reading a lot about ChatGPT, this artificial intelligence. There was a wonderful article in the New York Times written by Noam Chomsky. I don't know if you read it or if you have seen it, but Chomsky basically points out that the one thing that ChatGPT cannot do is the one thing that makes human beings so unique, and that is to reflect on moral questions and to arrive at an idea of the good and what is morally right. All ChatGPT can do is just like collect information. Well, some say this and some say that. No, but to arrive at this place where you have come to an ethical sense of what your moral responsibility is, that's what does make us truly human. It's going to be Jesus in front of Pilate and all of the ramifications that come with that is going to be so unique in the Gospel of John. And then finally, the beloved disciple. So that's where we'll go next week. We'll start in chapter 22, looking at Judas, who is, according to Spong, the figure of darkness. And he's going to give us a little insight into who this character symbolizes. So are there any questions or comments before we bid adieu? I don't say it right, as Constance will correct me. Adieu? Close. Okay, well, then I will see you then. I do want to say that I do have an all-day meeting next week, but I think I may have time for lunch. Please look for an email. I hate to have to cancel our time again, but it's like a 50-50 chance now that I might have to. I hate to do that because it's such a great place right now, and we're approaching Holy Week. But I'll try to work it out. Okay, so I'll see you all later. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Dan.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.